Hello, and welcome to Stream of Conscience, the show that celebrates local activism and is brought to you by Democracy for America, Fairfield County, a progressive, grassroots political organization that welcomes new members. I'm your host, John Hartwell. Our guest today is Representative Jim Himes, the Democrat who represents the 4th Congressional District here in Southwest Connecticut. Jim is a second-term member, first elected in 2008 and re-elected in 2010. Welcome to the show, Jim.
Thanks, John. Great to be here.
I imagine that your second year in Congress, your second term in Congress hasn't been quite as enjoyable as your first.
Enjoyable is an interesting word. It's certainly been less busy than the first. You know, that first term where we had the majority in the House and the Senate and, of course, the presidency, there was a lot of legislating. And there was a lot of legislating that needed to be done. The Dodd-Frank bill, of course, health care reform, the stimulus, these things were coming about every 4 weeks. And so here's, 4,000 pages of legislation to be read by Wednesday. Being in the minority now, in the House in particular, is always frustrating. You struggle with feelings of irrelevance, particularly when the majority in the House right now are doing things that are largely what they call message bills. Bills that are designed to get the Tea Party base excited, whether it's eliminating funding for Planned Parenthood or devastating poverty alleviation programs. These are not things that are going to become the policy of the United States, but they're political, and so it's doubly frustrating.
But Speaker Boehner, if I remember, said that he was going to make the House more open, that he was going to allow amendments, and that the process was going to be more reflective of both parties. Has that happened?
Well, actually, I give the Speaker credit on that count. Now, I don't agree with the Speaker on a lot of things, and certainly I'll tell you, I agree with the Speaker on more things than I agree with on the right wing of his party, which he, of course, has had a real challenge managing. But I do give him credit that he has brought lots of legislation to the floor under what's called an open rule, which basically means you can, wander onto the floor and offer up an amendment and debate it. And what it does is it really extends the process. And we've seen bills, be debated for days. And I actually think that's a good thing. Now, you can't do it with everything the federal government needs to legislate on, but I give them credit for opening up the process.
And so, from your point of view, what's been going on that's the most substantive that you think actually will impact federal policy going forward?
Well, two things come to mind. We did arrive, this would have been 2 months ago, 3 months ago, on a continuing resolution, agreement on a continuing resolution that allowed us to avert a government shutdown. And that was good, I think, from the standpoint of demonstrating that even under these circumstances, with 70 very aggressive right-wingers having newly arrived in the Congress, that compromises can still be made. Now, a lot of those guys didn't participate in the compromise, which of course means that the compromise was done more in the center of the two parties. But that was substantive and important. Obviously, we didn't want to see a government shutdown. The other thing is something that we are actually working on right now, which is patent reform. Now, this is real. And patent reform, it'll put you to sleep quickly, but it's really pretty critical for inventions and innovation and new businesses in our country. And we're finding that on that, we still argue, of course, but we're finding that there's, that there's good bipartisan meeting of the minds on that issue. Libya, which was what consumed the floor last week, was also interesting in its bipartisanship. You had a rejection of providing the president authority to operate in Libya for a year that came from both sides of the aisle, and then you had a bill rejected that would have very closely limited what funds could be used in Libya, again, in a bipartisan fashion.
So, in the middle of all of that, there was the question of the War Powers Act and whether President Obama is in fact following the law. And a lot of Republicans, for the very first time in my memory, are thinking that the War Powers Act might be a good thing. It was passed in the Democratic Congress long ago to rein in President Nixon, I believe. And it's been contested heavily by presidents of both sides ever since. We're clearly outside the frame in terms of the time that he should have reported back to Congress, if you believe that that he should be reporting. He, of course, says, well, we're not actually in hostilities, so I don't need to report. Where do you stand on all of that?
Well, let's start big with War Powers Act, and then I'll tell you exactly how I stand on all of that. You're right. Every president since Richard Nixon's veto of the War Powers Act was overridden by the Congress has refused to acknowledge the constitutionality of the War Powers Act. There you've got a separation of powers issue. The Republicans were beating up the president on this. I'm willing to give some of them, credit for standing on principle. Most of them, of course, are doing what Republicans have dedicated themselves to doing over the course of the last 2 years, which is simply doing whatever the president does and criticizing him. I mean, it was the classic Newt Gingrich moment, right? He beat up the president for not taking a more militaristic approach to Libya, and then when the president started bombing, Newt Gingrich came around and criticized him for that. Whatever the man does, of course, there is a segment that will criticize him for doing it, including abandoning long-held ideology. I mean, an awful lot of the election gains that they made last November were done because they posed as the defenders of Medicare against the Obama health reform. This is a party that for generations has been trying to eliminate Medicare.
Right.
So anyway, I digress. Look, here's what I think. If you look at the last 60 years of our history, the mistakes we have made have been too much executive authority on war making. Vietnam, Iraq, probably other conflicts where I wish Congress had been more closely consulted, Libya being one of them. So I'm a big believer that this country in the long run will be better off when we shift war-making power back to where Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution very clearly says it should reside, which is with the U.S. Congress. So with respect to Libya specifically, look, I've told you how I feel in an overarching way. It's hard for me to be critical. In fact, I'm not critical of the president for committing our forces for a very short period of time in Libya. There are thousands of people alive in Libya today, and the freedom and independence movement is alive because of the decision that the president took. Now, that being done, I really want to go back to the question of has he been authorized and should we be there? And on both points, I think the answer is no. I find this argument that these are not hostilities, which of course are very much in the service of what he is trying to do, to be wrong, frankly. Whenever you are contributing to violence somewhere in the world, that feels to me to be hostilities, whether you've actually got a guy with a gun or whether you're refueling guys with guns on their airplanes. So, I'm not with the president on this one, and in fact, I voted against authorization and I voted against anything but the most circumscribed use of dollars. The authority would have provided for refueling, for intelligence, surveillance, and search and rescue. I'm comfortable with that stuff. Beyond that, I'm not naturally an isolationist, and I hope that this is not something that becomes long-run entrenched in the way I think about things. But right now, at this moment in our history, coming out of Iraq, with the mess in Afghanistan, I really firmly believe that Libya has to be somebody else's fight.
And should NATO, for example, be leading that fight? I mean, is there a fight in Libya that we should be deeply involved in? Because at this point, it seems that there's a civil war going on. Obviously, Gaddafi is not someone that we would ever want to support, haven't in the past. But the question is, are we supposed to be helping them? Are we supposed to be tipping the balance one way or the other in what really is an internal struggle? Yeah, and I mean, that's a profound question to which there's no clear yes or no. I actually agree with the president that we had a national interest in seeing him not quash the freedom movement and kill tens of thousands of people. How do you describe that national interest? A couple of things. One, the credibility of the Security Council was at stake. It was an opportunity for the first time ever to have the Security Council, the NATO, and the Arab League all together standing up against a guy that we all recognize as a monster, who, and here's where we get to the national interest part, who could have caused great instability in that region. You could have seen tens of thousands of people on boats into Europe with the immigration issues that would cause. You would have seen the kind of disruptions, perhaps worse, of the oil supply that we are seeing right now. And I do believe that we have an interest in carefully and quietly, I hope,
nurturing accountability, freedom, democracy, and liberalization in the Arab world. And had Gaddafi quashed the rebellion, that would have been a huge blow. So again, I was okay with the president's initial actions, and I don't say that with a great deal of pride, because again, the war powers thing does trouble me. But at the end of the day, the Libyan people need to win their own independence. And we tipped the balance a little bit here, but I want to minimize our role now.
So expanding beyond Libya, which I think is a much easier sell for most people, there's a huge amount of problem going on in Yemen, and just today there was a report in the Times that Al-Qaeda type folks are taking advantage of that and expanding their control of various parts of Yemen. We've got Syria, which is clearly in upheaval, and where an even more brutal dictatorship is in charge and has, in fact, a history of slaughtering its own people when necessary. We can go back to 1982 and Assad's forces killing 10,000 people in the city of Hama in a very similar situation, so like father, like son. Mm-hmm. We've got problems in places like Bahrain, where we have the fleet is based, and where there's clearly a problem with between the governing authority, which is a Sunni monarchy, and the majority who are Shia, very much like Iraq was before Saddam Hussein was thrown out. Same exact kinds of imbalances going on there. What do we do in these places? Is there a general approach that you would have to say this is the framework, this is the philosophy that we would use in approaching these things?
Yeah. I think you asked the question in the right way, which is, yes, there can be a general philosophy. I'm not sure there can be a general strategy that applies across countries that are as different as Saudi Arabia and Syria, Jordan and Yemen, Iran and Egypt. These are countries that have, completely different characteristics, different languages, different tribal situations, different histories. So I do think there is an overarching philosophy, and I guess I would say it's this, which is that we have a profound national interest, and by the way, as does the rest of the world, including Europe, including Asia, including Israel, in urging carefully and consistently liberalization of these regimes. And we haven't done a terribly good job of that. We have acquiesced with Saudi autocracy. We acquiesced with Egyptian autocracy. We largely acquiesced with, in autocracy for a very long time.
I think rather acquiesce, we actually have actively supported.
That's in some cases that's very fair. And first it was because they were our friends relative to the Soviets. Now it's because they're our friends relative to Al-Qaeda. We always have an excuse, and we forget that our long-term interest is in liberalization of these autocratic regimes. So that's got to be the philosophy, and it's going to have some uncomfortable consequences for us. We're going to need to be much more direct with the Saudis, not only about the financing they provide to Wahhabism and to terrorist and quasi-terrorist organizations elsewhere, but about their own country, and about women driving and about women voting and that sort of thing. And you know what? It's going to be uncomfortable for us because we are so addicted to their oil. Iran's a different deal. We're obviously we're not in quite the same position with Iran as we are with Saudi Arabia, but nonetheless, we've got to be consistent with this idea of, if you want to be a trading partner, a friend of the United States, you're going to need to move towards better openness. Places like Jordan probably are. Places like Syria are probably moving backwards. The other thing I would say, and this isn't necessarily philosophy, but let's call it the difference between philosophy and tactics, because you brought up Yemen. There is potential in chaos, in vacuums, for some very bad things to happen. And I'm talking, of course, about Al-Qaeda getting a foothold. I don't believe that in the long run, radical extremist Islam offers anything to anybody. But I do know that in the short run, if you've got a chaotic region, they can build trading camps. They can be safe and secure to plot against us. So while we're pursuing this larger philosophy, I do think we need to lean forward hard, going after terrorists and Al-Qaeda. This is, by the way, where I would take Afghanistan. We're engaged in this nation-building mission in Afghanistan, which, I suppose sounds good if you're a real optimist about Afghanistan and our ability to change it. I've been there. But our real, I was with Biden from the start. Our real national interest is going after Al-Qaeda, which is largely in Pakistan.
So how did you feel when the president came out the other night and said, basically, we're going to take another year to withdraw the additional troops that he put in, and at the end of that time, we're going to have as many people still in Afghanistan as were there when he walked in the door in January of 2009. I mean, I understand that he campaigned that, you know, Afghanistan was the good war and Iraq was the bad war, and he's pulling out the troops in Iraq, and hopefully, you know, we're going to be out of there completely very soon, and clearly leaving behind a situation that's still very much in flux and not what we want it to be, certainly not what the neocons predicted it was going to be so happily back in 2003. But the question here is, in Afghanistan, we're still going to have, you know, 60,000, 65,000 troops a year from now. And some vague promise that we're going to pull them out by 2014, which is, you know, well after the first term of this president is there, so he really won't have any control over that in some, you know, in some possibility. So why are we there when there isn't any real Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan anymore? It was reported that maybe 100, 200 Al-Qaeda operatives in a country with 25 million people and a vast territory. But the real problem is clearly in Pakistan. And the problem in Pakistan is much more than Al-Qaeda. It's the fact that Pakistan is an inherently unstable country. It's had multiple military coups over the years. It's fought several wars with India. It got itself split into two pieces because Bangladesh used to be part of it. And they have nuclear weapons. So an extraordinarily unstable place. And we're fueling the fire in Pakistan, and we're camped out in Afghanistan with 100,000 troops with really no end in sight. What are we supposed to do there?
Yeah. Well, so how did I feel when the president made his announcement? I was disappointed. I really wanted to see a change in strategy. And I alluded earlier, I was always in the Biden camp of let's not try to create stability in a nation that has avoided stability, thrown off stability for millennia. Let's leave the governing and the security of Afghanistan and the rollout of the roads and the schools to the Afghan people. Let's pursue a strategy of tracking down terrorists, the ones who got us there in the first place. Now, people point out that the Taliban sheltered Al-Qaeda prior to 9/11. Fair point. And guess what? They got theirs. We took them out, and I think most Americans would say that that's a fair thing. But, you know, this notion that and let's face it, we're trying to nation build in Afghanistan. And so I was disappointed. I would like to see a shift in strategy. Why did the president do what he did, and what are the generals telling him? Look, I think, first of all, the military, now that I professionally spend time around them, their virtue is also something that we as civilian leadership need to keep an eye on. They will complete a mission, and that's a wonderful, spectacular thing. But it is up to the civilians to say, but is that mission ultimately achievable in a meaningful political strategic way, and is it the mission that we want to complete right now? The other thing I would say is that obviously people who think about this stuff are worried about a chaotic Afghanistan. The Haqqani networks, the Quetta Shura that is now in Pakistan, if there were a chaotic vacuum in Afghanistan, they'd be right back. And that's a fair concern. What I'd prefer to see would be a negotiation. Let's face it, the Taliban, who you and I both know are a bizarre mixture of warlords and drug lords and radical Muslims, not necessarily including a whole lot of Al-Qaeda, but there's some. You know, they're a real amalgam. They're going to be at the table when a peace is ultimately struck. So my point of view would be, let's get that negotiation underway now. Get a real dialogue going between, God help us, you know, Hamid Karzai and all of the other players, people with power in the region, to try to get them to agree to some divvying up of power in the country so that we can focus on going after the bad guys. And we say to the Taliban and to everybody else, we have two interests here. One, you guys figure it out. You cannot sponsor terrorism. And by the way, Mr. Taliban, if you're the Minister of the Interior and you're running training camps in Helmand province, you have an address and we know where to find you. And so we can enforce that edict, that one overwhelming interest we would have in those negotiations. And by the way, we'd probably want to attach some other things, which is, you know, the decent respect of the rest of the world is worth something. So let women go to school. Don't do summary public executions the way you used to. So, but anyway, my point is that's a negotiation to be had. And then, and you know, here's where the solution is never quite as simple as, you know, dropping bombs or pulling triggers. Then go to Pakistan and deal with the issue that is the issue there, which is India. right? And just as I said, we have to tell the Saudis that they've got to, do what, liberalize. Go to Pakistan and say it's profoundly in our interest and your interest to sit down at the table with India and work this stuff out, because you're in bed with people who want to kill you, and you're playing a double game with us. You're quote unquote helping us against the terrorists with one hand while you sponsor terrorists with another. This is not a long-term sustainable thing. So anyway, that's what I was hoping to hear, but it's not where we are right now.
I think I understand what you're coming from, and it makes perfect sense when we're sitting here. The problem is that all of these people have their own interests, and they have their own perceptions, and we're coming from a long way away, and yes, we have a lot of power that we can pinpoint and say, yes, we know where you live, and we can come and get you if we have to. But they know, and we should know, that sooner or later, we're going to leave. And at that point, they're on their own. And at that point, any agreement that they've made, which has been somewhat persuaded or forced by us, is going to be torn up, and they'll go back to doing whatever they did before. And so, from my point of view, the longer we stay there, we simply are putting off the day of reckoning that they have to come to. And in the meantime, we're spending over $100 billion a year in Afghanistan alone. We're losing, soldiers left and right. We're, eating away at whatever support we might have had throughout the Middle East, and we know that it's critical that we can't have the entire Middle East turn against us. And so, I just don't see where, we've got American power of a certain very hard military sort, and we have a lot of soft power that comes through Hollywood and through software and through all of those things that they really, really want. But when it comes to telling Pakistan that they've got to solve their problem with India, I don't see where we're a player.
Well, two thoughts on that. One, we're a player anywhere in the world through both our hard and our soft power. Pakistan's military, frankly, wouldn't be nearly what it is without the billions in aid that we send there. That's a heck of a card to put on the table. You got to do it carefully, but that's a heck of a card to put on the table. We have, values and political resonance with India. I actually do think we've got a card to play there. And by the way, at the end of the day, is it in the interests of the nation of India, or ultimately in the interest of the nation of Pakistan, or ultimately in the interest of China, who sits there above both countries, to have this conflagration, this constant fight between? It's not, right? So there's at least a hope, at least a chance. And again, that's at the heart of Pakistan's bad behavior vis-a-vis us. Yeah. And look, you're right. I mean, I hope you didn't misunderstand me. I don't believe that the deal is that we somehow persuade the Taliban to be nice people by any definition we have. I think our interest in Afghanistan is very, very limited, which is don't promote and support and harbor terrorists. That we can enforce. The sad fact is, and this is as true in Afghanistan as it is in Libya, try as we might, we can't force democracy. Look, no, 90%, absolutely. You know this better than I do. You've been in the country. Yeah. 90% illiteracy in Afghanistan. What is the meaning of democratic government in an almost totally illiterate country? They've got generations of work to do before we're comfortable viscerally with their system of government.
But even in terms of terrorists and supporting terrorists and harboring terrorists and having them live 20 minutes away from your main military school in a country where we've been supplying them with billions of dollars and lots of guns. And when we take out Osama bin Laden, what is the response in Pakistan? They get mad. And the army in Pakistan is now enraged, and there's even talk that there might be a colonel's coup to take over the country because they're really upset. And they don't like the senior military because they think the senior military leadership has kowtowed to us for too long, and they have no respect whatsoever for the civilian leadership in the country. So here's the situation. Couldn't have been clearer. Osama bin Laden was living in the middle of the country, literally a stone's throw away from their West Point, in a town that is dominated by military people. And when we take him out, their response is, how could you possibly do this to us? I mean, where do we go with this? How in the world can we deal with this country?
this is one of those, the way you articulate the question, it's one of those things where, what you want as a human is different from what you know to be true as a policymaker, which as a human, you just want to wash your hands of the whole god-awful mess, right? And say the ISI, this insane, sort of military-led quasi-democracy, we just don't care. But we do care for one big reason, which is about 90 nuclear weapons, right? And this is where the policymaker comes in. Nothing would be more emotionally satisfying than to just walk out of Pakistan and say, you guys are a mess. And by the way, you're not getting any more of our taxpayer dollars, but they've got 90 nuclear weapons and they're terribly unstable. So regardless of the hurdles, regardless of the pain that we feel emotionally in having to engage with some very bad people, and I'm not saying that all of the leadership is very bad, but there's some, I don't see the alternative to not engaging in a country that is unstable, that has serious extremist Islam and nuclear weapons. You just can't walk away from that, right?
I understand that entirely. It's just, at what point do you draw the line? And it's a very, very difficult question.
Yeah.
We've got a line to draw here because we've run out of time on this segment, but we're going to come back. This is John Hartwell, Stream of Conscience. And we're brought to you by Democracy for America, Fairfield County. We're always looking for new members. So remember, change is possible, and you can make it happen. Hope to see you again soon.